Today, we witness the persistence of war, of racism, sexism, and religious and secular fanaticism. Noor Inayat-Khan, may God be pleased with her, offers us another vision, another choice that we too must make in our lives. Most people don't know this, but since the first Iraq war, approximately 6 million Muslims have died in the wars against Iraq and Afghanistan. This approximately the same number of Jewish victims of the Nazi Holocaust. Noor was born to an Indian Sufi teacher, Hazrat Inayat-Khan, and his American wife, Aura Ray Baker. Noor risked and ultimately sacrificed her life for liberty, truth, and justice. During a time when far-right political ideologies and Islamophobia are on the rise, it's urgent to hear the story of a Muslim heroine who gave everything to help defeat the Nazis. We often hear about freedom fighters such as Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., but too rarely do we hear about Muslims, about Noor, about Abdul Ghaffar Khan, about Ahmadu Bamba. Yet Noor reflects not only the best virtues of Muslims and Sufis, but of all of humanity. Dr. Pir Zia Inayat-Khan wrote about his aunt Noor. Noor has a way of challenging our received categories. Her deep spirituality was utterly devoid of religious chauvinism, just as her profound commitment to the cause of liberty was unalloyed with any trace of nationalist zeal. She freely admitted to being as prepared to defend India's freedom from Britain as she was to defend Britain's freedom from Germany. Noor was a kind of new patriot, a knight in the service of the entire human realm. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Pir Zia Inayat-Khan, the spiritual leader of the Inayati Order, an interfaith mystical fellowship with branches worldwide. Pir Zia is a scholar of religion and teacher of Sufism in the lineage of his grandfather, the Indian mystic and musician Hazrat Inayat-Khan. His books include Saracen Chivalry, Counsels on Valor, Generosity, and the Mystical Quest, and Mingled Waters, Sufism and the Mystical Unity of Religions. Pir Zia and his family live in Richmond, Virginia, where he regularly offers classes and programs at the Inayati Order's North American headquarters. Let me say that I've rarely met another human being who is as mindful about what they say and do. His words and deeds are chosen with care and come from the heart. I'd like to also add that I personally believe that all of the religions come from the same source, from the one God. But today, many of them have decayed. If we were to imagine a tree, many of the branches are withering. But Pir Zia has found a way to go to the roots of the tree, and offers a branch with flowers and fruit that are quite plentiful and vibrant. So I encourage everyone to read his works. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Pir Zia Inayat-Khan.
Thank you so much, Zachary Markwith, for that very gracious welcome. Humbled by your kind words and moved to be here tonight with all of you in a gathering place known as Hub, which suggests to me love, and which reminds me also of the word hub, a related word meaning seed. And so, as we remember the life and heroism of Pirzadi Shahida Noor, I find myself reflecting on love as a plant that begins as a speck in the heart of every person, And if that speck, if that seed is nurtured with the water of life, and if it is warmed by the divine sunshine, then the infinitude that is hidden in that minute point begins to unfurl. A stem rises up, and from that stem, branches, leaves, flowers, and at last fruit. This is the meaning of love. Within every soul, there is this plenitude, but it's hidden until its moment has arrived, until the spring of the soul has come. And then that vastness can show itself. And my understanding, this is what the story of Noor reveals. One sees in the course of the passage of her life, unfurling of this marvelous plant, this plant of love, that has at last bestowed fruit which is nourishing to the hearts of succeeding generations. Myself, I obtained great nourishment from her story. At the same time, it hasn't been an easy story for me to enter into. People often ask me many questions about my aunt, and I regret that I don't know all of the answers. And why don't I know more? I ask myself, why didn't I ask my father as many questions as I could? He passed away in the year 2004. Before then, I had many chances to inquire all about Noor. But I didn't. Why? Whenever my father spoke about his sister, tears came into his eyes, and he was moved to the core. It wasn't a subject I could take up lightly with him. To mention her name was to evoke his profound love of her, but also the deep wound, the shattering that he experienced when he discovered her fate. And that wound was very profound in him. And I subliminally inherited. So that when the biography of Noor, written by wonderful author Shrabani Basu, when it was published, you might have imagined that I would have rushed to read it. Didn't. It sat on my shelf for a long time, or I would start to read it, and then I would put it down. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared so much, and I wasn't ready to go into the dungeon of Pforzheim, where she was chained to a wall, hands and feet chained together, day after day, night after night, solitary confinement, when she was tortured. But I steeled myself, and I read it, and I since have sought wherever I could information about her. And it's never easy to delve into her story. Is paradoxically for me both the greatest inspiration, she's the most shining light to guide my path, but also the hardest thing to do. Source of keen sadness. But Noor has come to me, I believe. You know, there is a belief that some souls, when they leave this world, they look onward and don't look back. And there are others who keep connected with this world. They still have some service to render. I believe Noor is such a soul. I feel her presence. And recently this was made very tangible when I was looking through our Sufi archive and discovered a file marked by her name. And opening it, discovered a play that she had written, which I had never before read. It was a hidden treasure. Tibetans have a name for this phenomenon, terma. That is to say, a wisdom book that's hidden from humanity until its time has come. The moment of its discovery has arrived. I believe this play of Noors is such a book. Perhaps I wasn't ready to receive it until last year, a year ago. Meanwhile, of course, I have delved into her Jataka tales, her legendary stories that describe the heroism of animals who reflect the light of the Buddha and make great sacrifice. Her own sacrifice was prefigured in these narratives, such as in that of the great elephant. I spoke of it in the film. The manuscript that she wrote out is with us. That's the story of an elephant that comes across a group of travelers in the wilderness who have lost their way and who are starving. And they ask, where can they find food? And the elephant knows there is no food nearby. But he says this, go to the other side of the hill, and there you will find something to nourish you. Meanwhile, the elephant climbs the hill and leaps. And they come across the body of the fallen elephant. And they realize that he has given of himself this way so that they may all together fulfill their journey toward their destination. She wrote this story. It was one of her tellings of these ancient legends. You can see already in her young mind, her own self-giving was in preparation. She spoke about sacrifice, the value of it, in little things and in big things. Sacrifice is love. That's what love is. Rather than asserting one's demands, trying to gain the upper hand, attaining all that one can of the good things of the world, love is magnanimous self-giving. She was studying this. She was collecting narratives from classical literature that portray these ideals. She was preparing her own soul for this great heroic act. Now you've heard the story in the movie. I won't reiterate the arc of her life, but I would like to underscore a few characteristics that I believe are still very relevant, universally, eternally relevant. First of all, she was constantly attentive to what is subtle and what is unseen. Hence her great appreciation of fairy tales and her own renderings of fairy tales. She was conscious of the jinn world and the angelic world. She wasn't constrained by the rationalism that so much defines our contemporary mentality. She was alert to subtle and invisible things. This world was an enchanted world. Furthermore, she was, as was emphasized in the movie, a great idealist. She believed in ethical principles which were paramount, which absolutely trumped any consideration of personal gain. Absolutely clear about this throughout her life. The primacy of the ideals that guided her life. And in our Sufi path, these are exemplified in a series of contemplative principles called the iron rules, copper rules, silver rules, and gold rules. Essentially, these are reflections upon the ethical fabric that connects our life with every other life and the necessity of maintaining the integrity of these connections. So she wasn't moved by a subjective motivation in her service. She wasn't fighting for a particular nationality or a particular religion, particular ideology. She was serving for the sake of these universal ethical values that are relevant in all times and in all places. And this is very much evident in her response when she was asked very pointedly, when interviewed for the position that she took on in the SOE. She was asked about her loyalty to the British Crown. Already the independence movement in India was gaining momentum, and having Indian background, there was a concern about her loyalty. But she was very clear in her answer. No, she wasn't going to pledge unconditional loyalty to the British nation, to the British crown. In this war effort, for this cause, she would give her all. She was prepared to make any sacrifice for the justice of this cause. But she said, after this, I reserve the right and intend to fight for the independence of India. So she wasn't a nationalist, wasn't serving one particular country over others. She was in the service of the freedom of all people. Now this is an important consideration when we consider the integration of peoples of diverse backgrounds in our contemporary cosmopolitan societies in the West. There remains a level of skepticism toward the other, And the notion that the citizenry of a particular Western democracy is most reliably constituted by those who can trace their ancestry to that nation over many generations. Whereas immigrants, and particularly those who practice a religion which is not the majority one of such a nation, are looked upon with skepticism, oftentimes, as to their commitment to that community. And this skepticism, in turn, can lead second-generation immigrants, that is to say the children of immigrant families, to feel never fully at home in the country in which they are born and raised, and lead to a feeling of alienation. And so the example of Noor, and there are other shining examples, helps to bring home the reality that Muslims, migrants of other lands, might be Hindus or people of other origins, may certainly contribute in a way that is vital, in fact, to the democracy, to the freedom of the land in which they have found themselves, and that their spiritual traditions and their cultural traditions should not be seen as a bar to this. On the contrary, what the film so clearly emphasizes is that Noor's background, the idealism that came through the Sufi tradition that she inherited, spiritual principles that came through the religious and cultural inheritance that she absorbed, in fact, spurred her on, made her an extraordinary and unique fighter for the freedom of the West against fascism and tyranny. So I think in a moment we'll have some discussion. Maybe I'll just come back briefly to this book because, as I mentioned, I feel it is a dispensation from al-ghaib, from the invisible, that this book has manifested itself. And it's another sign of what Noor was doing. It wasn't only in her wartime career, but in her literary career. She was building a bridge between East and West, and this book represents the Aid of the Ocean and Land. It's a retelling of the Odyssey of Homer, and it's told through the lens of the Mantiqater of Sheikh Fariduddin Attar. So the play unfolds in 7 acts, and each act corresponds to one of the valleys in that great Sufi poem of Attar. And now the retelling of Homer's great epic, which is a foundation, of course, of Western civilization, in Noor's retelling, Odysseus, Ulysses, becomes a symbol of her father. There are biographical elements in the play, and more generally of the Insan al-Kamil, the complete human being. And we see the complete human being developing through a series of events and initiations. And essentially this development has to do with the encounter with pain and transformation through that encounter. Ulysses begins rather hard-hearted, but in the course of these encounters, his heart opens. And when he finally returns to Ithaca, in the Odyssey, in Homer's account, what remains is to vanquish the rivals, to kill them all, and to reclaim his house and family. But in Noor's telling, the end is very different. In Noor's telling, as Ulysses has traveled, his heart has transformed, and now he faces a dilemma. And that is to go back to the past and try to cling to what he had intended to reclaim, or whether to venture onward. He becomes a vairagi, that is to say, a renunciate, but with a difference. And here a certain nuance comes in, which introduces a distinction between the vairagya of Indian spirituality, which has to do with leaving one's family and going off into a cave, leaving the world, and a Sufic vision of detachment where one may remain connected in love, but having transcended attachment, so it's now an unconditional love. And that's what the climax of the play reveals, this very profound and vast vision of love, which includes the human development, but now with a sense of freedom in which there's no clinging and no egoism. So the play describes this transformation of the heart and represents Noor's powerful synthesis of Sufi vision and Western culture as embodied in the Odyssey of Homer.
Thank you so much, Pir Zia, for sharing those very personal and insightful reflections on the life, example, and teachings of your aunt, Noor Inayat-Khan. I'd like to ask if you could expand some on how Noor took from your father's teachings and Sufi teachings in general, and really the heritage of world spirituality, on the unity of humanity and creation, and how that might have inspired her actions.
Yes, well, from the beginning, Noor was interested in the sacred literature of all lands. And in fact, we have notes that arose from her studies in the Bible and in the Quran. And so she was actively studying these scriptures and at the same time delving deeply into the fairy tale traditions of many lands. In fact, even while she was training in Scotland during her SOE training, she made notes that reflected her intention to seek out the old women of Scotland and try to learn the fairy tales from them. So she was universal in her sense of the prevalence of wisdom everywhere, and she had the motivation to draw together the wisdom of many lands, and this is in accord with the Quranic understanding of the unity of prophecy down the ages, and how different prophetic dispensations have given rise to a variety of religions, but how ultimately the divine guidance is one guidance, and it's possible to gather in the essence in the way that a honeybee gathers pollen from so many different flowers and makes honey. And we see that at work in her deep, earnest study of all of the scriptures of the world.
You've also written a wonderful book, an imaginative book, and book that really teaches virtue from the place of the heart on chivalry, Saracen chivalry. It's been enthusiastically recommended by T.J. Winter, one of our great scholars, Abdul Hakim Murad. Can you speak about the history of spiritual chivalry in our Abrahamic tradition with Abraham, Muhammad, Ali, Hussein, but also outside of that tradition, the Kshatriya in India, the samurai, the martial arts in China, and even the romantic tradition in Christianity? How can we be inspired by this today?
Yes, wonderful question. Yes, well, just as you say, there is a very ancient tradition which is known in Sufism as Futuwa or Javan Mardi, and which oftentimes is traced especially to Abraham, although it is said actually to go back to the very first prophet, Adam. So it's, and peace be upon him, and peace be upon Ibrahim alayhi salam. So there is this sense that chivalry has always been part of the experience of humanity as illuminated by divine guidance, but it came especially forward in the time of Prophet Abraham. And one of the stories that explains this tells of how some people who were living around Abraham were very moved by his profound magnetism, and they wanted to learn from him. And he instructed them to go to a cave and to perform many, many prayers, fasts, and meditations, and so forth. And they did so and became illuminated. And this is the prelude to the Sufism that emerged in the community of the Prophet Muhammad. It's that same tradition of profound inner reflection and practice. But then the story goes that there were some others who came to the Prophet Abraham and said, "We also are very moved by your example, but we can't do what the others have done because we live in the world." These were pillars of society. They had families, they had professions which were contributing to the community. And how can we follow you? And it said this was the way in which chivalry was introduced, that Prophet Abraham gave practices to them to lead a spiritual life in the world. And one of the primary principles of this path of chivalry is it isn't necessarily a path always of pacifism. There is no absolute notion of passivity, or even necessarily always of non-violence. However, the essential principle is when you must be involved in a conflict, be involved without any motivation of malice, of hatred, enmity. And actually, I must say, for that reason, I have mixed feelings about the title of the movie we've just watched, because it's a wonderful movie. First of all, I want to just express, as always, my appreciation to Robert Gardner and his team. But the title, Enemy of the Reich, well, there's an old in Sufi chivalry, which is that the Javan Mard, the chivalrous youth, is the one who has no enemy. And does that mean that that one is never involved in any conflict? Well, all of us are potentially subject to conflicts all of the time, especially in the presence of tyranny and injustice. One has to take a stand if one has moral courage. So it doesn't mean, not to have an enemy doesn't mean that you don't stand up for what is right, but it means that you don't do so in a spirit of malice, without any mental denigration of the soul of the other. You affirm the soul of the one who is opposite you in this struggle, but you have to stand for the ethical order of the world. So that inner purification of one's motivation and the avoidance of any disparagement and enmity, bile toward the adversary is crucial. And without that, there is no chivalry whatsoever. It's illustrated in that great story of Hazrat Ali.
That Rumi retells in the Masnavi.
Yes.
Yes. This beautiful story, would you like to share it? Sure. Yeah, so Ali is on the battlefield, and he's peace be upon him, he's faced by this fierce opponent, and he has the opponent on the ground, and the opponent spits in Ali's face. Rumi calls him the pride of all of the prophets and the saints. And instead of slaying the opponent, he drops his sword and walks away. And when asked, why did you do this? He said, when you spat on my face, I became angry. And I was acting from a place of the ego, not in the service of the truth. And so he had to renounce acting from that place of ego. I'm also reminded of a story from Star Wars, where in the Empire Strikes Back, Luke is training with Yoda, and he sees in this training simulation his father. I'm sort of giving away the ending, and he's fighting the enemy, and the enemy's wearing a mask, and he strikes at the mask, and the mask, when it is revealed, he sees his own face, which is sort of the lesson here, is that the greater struggle is the one against your own soul, I think.
Jihad al-Akbar, yeah. The jihad. And Yoda is a green man, like Khwaja Khizr. Yes. Yeah.
I'd like to ask you one more question before I open it up to the audience. The Quran has this memorable verse about the true martyrs, which I believe Noor was. Say not those who were slain in God's way as dead, nay, they are living, but you perceive it not. I think you alluded to this in your talk.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that she has a place not unlike Beatrice in Dante's work and life. Can you allude to how she and other luminaries might guide people today?
When Noor volunteered for the war, it wasn't yet known. The full extent of the atrocities of the Nazis weren't yet known. The concentration camps hadn't been discovered. There was only partial knowledge of the acts of the Nazis. But what was known was enough to convince her that this scourge was utterly unacceptable and had to be challenged. And what was known was that this ideology of Nazism, not only was it a threat to the egalitarianism of modern democracy, but specifically there was in it the denigration of people of certain races and people of certain religions. And Noor's whole training from her father had been one of respect. Respect the human soul. Respect the lineage of the prophets. Respect the unity of all peoples. And when those fundamental principles erode, when there is scapegoating and targeting of people who are more vulnerable because of being in the minority, then we can't let that pass. That isn't to be turned away from. That's to be confronted directly. And that means being willing to put oneself on the line and take a courageous stance, even when the consequences may be serious for oneself. So she encourages us by her example not to turn and look away, not to expect someone else will take that stand. When we see justice undermined, when we see freedom and respect denied, then we've got to raise our voice. We've got to take a stand. We've got to show our solidarity to one another and stand as one humanity.
When Pir Zia talked of Homer, I'm reminded of the great treasures brought through the dark ages of Christianity. These wisdoms were carried, thanks to Islam, and reseeded back into the West. For me personally, for the first time, I hear in Homer's tale of Ulysses slaying his rivals, I hear my duty to slay my inner rivals for my inner queen. The inner jihad of being brave and strong and not weak in dealing with my inner enemies. I thank you for this new understanding.
Yes, in Noor's telling, though, I must add, Ulysses neglects to do any such thing. He pays no attention to the rivals, which is curious, because in the whole course of his adventures, he has one goal: to recover what is his wife and his house. Now, his heart has been so transformed in the course of the journey through the encounter with pain. He has been stretched beyond himself, and now he doesn't care about his house at all. But what does remain is his affection for his wife and son. So they're haunting, moving passages where he is floating around the outskirts of his old home. His voice is heard by Penelope. He feels her presence, but they haven't yet found the new form of that relationship which will constitute the progress of the souls of the two of them. They can't go back. And so the rivals, of course, hound Penelope when she makes the great move of now leaving home herself. That's the great culmination of this play, is that there's a tension between returning to the old form of a domestic life versus just leaving it all behind. And in all of this, both for Penelope and for Ulysses, what arises is a complete unconcern with the rival. And that dramatically distinguishes Norris Telling from Homer's. And I think it's very interesting. One could, perhaps in Sufic terms, one could look at it as the difference between suluk and jazba. That is to say, suluk is one means of pursuing the path, which involves discipline, self-discipline. It involves looking into yourself, discovering your confused impulses, confronting them, rooting them out, and doing so with great intentness. So that's one way. There's another way, jazba, which is being swept up in the divine love. One is swept through love beyond the narrowness and compulsiveness of one's confused instincts, which are the consequence of a narrow egoic frame. But when that frame is swept away in love, it's like, as Khwaja Nizamuddin said, there are two ways to clear a forest. One is by cutting tree by tree, stroke by stroke of the axe. The other is to light a spark, and it burns. So that spark is love. And that love is what, as it were, leaves no room for rivals. In fact, a Sufi of olden times said, Sufism is something not quite right. He said, because Sufism means removing the rivals of God from one's view, removing the other, removing that which is other than God from one's view. That's Sufism. Remove what is other from the view. But he said that's not right, because there is no other than God. But the Sufis sometimes like to, in that way, undermine the stability of the tradition's own definition of itself and challenge us in the things that we take for granted. Essentially, the sense that hal arrives, a state arrives in which that arduous work of inner disentangling is superseded now by the great unraveling that comes with the immensity of the discovery of love.
Your story. I have a bit of a two-part question. First, I'm thrilled to hear that you discovered a play by her. I've been a fan of the Jataka Tales. Are there other manuscripts, first of all? And second, how do we share Noor's story with the younger generation, which I think can be very well impacted and can learn from her?
Oh yeah, wonderful questions. Well, I'm so glad you say that, because that's what Noor really cared about. She cared about children. And she was, when the war came, she was studying child psychology at the Sorbonne. She was writing stories for children. She wrote in Le Figaro newspaper, she wrote stories for children that were published there. And she wrote a series of poems to her mother. Every year on her mother's birthday, she would write a poem and draw a little picture. And these poems are so wonderful because they're all about the bond between mother and child. And that is clearly something that Noor was very interested in. She saw how the formation of a human being begins in those earliest moments, in the arms of the mother, through the voice of the mother, and how that, the seed of love, the harb, really grows from that root, and how precious, therefore, that root is. And so, so those poems are a kind of teaching, actually. Her teaching about mother as the first guru. That's an Indian tradition. Very first guru is the mother, second is the father, and the third is the pir or the guru. The sense that for children, for parents and children alike, the cultivation of the preciousness of that relationship establishes a basis of love, of kindness, that can then grow out and reflect itself in all kinds of relationships. So she loved children. She wanted to cultivate the love element in them and inculcate stories of heroes, stories of idealism and self-sacrifice. And that was her natural audience. So she left many precious things for us. Jataka Tales, certainly. There's another volume which has been recently published called King Akbar's Daughter. I don't know if you know that one. And that has stories from different parts of the world, showing again her vast universality. There are old French chivalric legends there. Juan of Bordeaux is there, and stories of different lands. And these are ones that young people can easily relate to. And then also there are some other things that haven't been published yet that I'm working on collecting and gathering together, including some of her own personal notes and reflections and things of this kind, which are also very striking. And I keep finding more and more. Maybe I'll just share with you as we come toward the close something that recently came to me from her personal notes. And these were notes written when she was undergoing training, which must have been extremely arduous and stressful. But even during that time, she would write poems and note down plans for fairy tales and so forth. And so she was studying the European chivalric traditions, and particularly the traditions of King Arthur's court. And she shares these words, which really do prefigure her own further life. Here and there in this text, there are some gaps because it's in handwriting that was written out perhaps very quickly, and so we still have to decipher a few words. But we find these words. No one can deny that the legends which originate from Arthur's Round Table personify the spirit of blank in all of its democracy, in all of its nobility. There is an integrity about these, an unbeaten steadfastness, and constant bearing in mind of the aim. The medieval heroes were chivalrous knights, immensely brave, but more adventurous in a way, getting into trouble more easily, going forward, losing blank, but winning in the end at the cost of a mighty sacrifice. And such they are, and such they always shall be. Perfect articulation of her own life.
Thank you so much, Pir Zia, for joining us this evening. Your message of Noor, of humility, of oneness, of justice, of peace, it really comes through. And I think what impresses me most is that Noor, yourself, you express your beliefs in, more than just words. Religion isn't just what we say, but it's how we behave. And this emphasis on the virtues, I think, is key, and it's instructive and illuminating for me. Thank you all as well for joining us this evening. And thanks to the Hub Foundation team who made this possible. Sara, Dre Jr., Ati, Ellie, Sherry. Thank you all as well.